to what I believe must be the 24th monthly Orienteering USA Forum. So 2-year anniversary coming up next month. For this time, we have mapper extraordinaire Jon Campbell to tell us some of the things he's learned over the years about the map symbols as that would be useful to you as an orienteer in the woods, trying to get from control to control, not so much for the purposes of being a mapper yourself. Jon, you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen? I think you're muted, Jon.
Jon, you are muted.
Perfect. Auspicious start. This may be a little bit of a misnomer here as an athlete's primer, because this is certainly not sort of basic map reading. But we thought, the mapping committee, myself, John Torrance, and Christina, thought that it would be worthy of a forum to talk through. And I see lots of experienced orienteers that have logged in, lots of experienced mappers too. So we certainly don't have all the right answers, and we're happy to let this go off slide a little bit. Although we have deputized Christina if we go down some sort of mapping rabbit hole, as mappers are apt to do. Christina has already been deputized to bring us back on track. So. For those that don't know, I'm going to use Forest OMaps all night, and there is an IOF standard out there on what mapping looks like. It defines 100 odd symbols. It's a 43-page document, lots of fine print. You will hear mappers call it ISOM. Stands for International Specification for Orienteering Maps. They have tried to get themselves back on about a once a decade update. So they are collecting things for the ISOM 2030 update as we speak. There is a separate document for sprint maps, right? Because it is based on this document, but they're just different enough that they have their own mapping standard. And there's a link there if you ever want to go check that out. We don't intend to turn this into the basics of reading a map, right? We don't intend to turn this into a mapping discussion, get into mapper rules of thumb, how we classify things. But people that have done a bunch of mapping have probably see things in maps that good orienteering maps that you didn't even realize were a thing, right? So hopefully you'll walk away from this learning something, and the topics we plan to sort of plow down through are over there on the right-hand side. And the first thing that is worth talking about is the scales that ISOM is intended for, right? So it specifically says it has a base scale of 1 to 15,000. Not too many of us run on 1 to 15,000 maps anymore, right? Those symbols are really at the limit of printing technology and your ability to detect them at speed with a human eye, right? So a lot of times folks will see map problems. Something's not quite right, but to diagnose it, you actually have to look at it under a magnifier, right? Which is sort of crazy at that scale. Many of us are much more familiar with a 1 to 10,000 scale. That has become standard even for elites. The symbols from the manual are proportionally enlarged. So they're 150% of the size that's shown. And the software generally does that for you unless you override something. And then it follows on to the other scales, 1 to 7,500 that are often used for older or younger orienteers. And then the largest scale mentioned in ISOM is 1 to 5,000, right? So that's a 300% enlargement, and it starts to look like a crayon drawing, right? You start to see the flaws that any drafter is going to have in there, which is why it's really not intended to go beyond that. And a couple of other minor things that's worth noting magnetic north line spacing is defined as 300 meters. And that's important because some people at those different scales use that as a quick way to measure things. The control circles also have a defined size, right? And other people use that as sort of a quick way to measure something. So I would always recommend when you're using software, Purple Pen, Condes, keep the IOF defaults in there unless there's a real reason to change it. Sometimes happens on white courses when trail junctions are so close that the circles, right, overlap, that sort of thing. But in general, go with the IOF sizes because it matters to someone. The first big topic that's worth getting into, and I think most people have figured this out, is that the darker the green, the worse the slower the orienteering, the slower the movement, and the worse the visibility, right? So there's sort of a combination there of slower speed and reduced visibility, and it is actually defined by IOF on what it should be. Right. And of course, it's all in minutes per kilometer. And I did some quick conversions over here for those that are more familiar with speed in miles. Right. These are not terribly fast times if you were considered running on, a road race, right, or a track workout. Right. But that is realistic for what elites are doing through the woods. You can see that it applies to greens, and we're going to talk on the next couple of slides. It applies to some other of those area features that are out there that are intended to show you, hey, this is about how fast you're going to be able to move through the woods in this section. Just another way of looking at this and bringing in the green stripe, right? The undergrowth symbol. You've got your dark green fight. You've got your medium green walk. You've got your light green slow run, right? Well, there's an equivalent of that in both single and double slash, as it's often called, where you've got that same speed, but you've got better visibility. So typically that is low to the ground stuff, whether it's deadfall, whether it's low bush blueberry, it could be all manner of things. But you'll note a couple of things on this slide, right, that it really doesn't differentiate between if it's also forested or generally open. That's done with the background color. And in fight, it doesn't matter, right? When you're at that slow, there's no differentiation in the mapping between something that is open and something that is forested. The yellow and white sort of collapse. Sometimes mappers will show some difference there with a distinct vegetation boundary if it's relevant, but there are a few orienteers that make a habit of smashing their way through fight. But let's be honest, most of us prefer to go around it for good reason. And we talked that briefly. There is also, back on that original slide, which was straight out of the ISOM manual, there is greater than 100% running, right? And that's intended for the stuff that is really fast. The pavement and the open land, bright yellow, both are intended for, effectively track speed workouts and track workout speeds and, great visibility, which we would expect, right? And then there's some analog in stony ground. And I'm not sure a lot of people realize this, but stony ground is intended to have 3 different densities to it that represent that same reduced runability through slow run, walk, and fight version of stony ground. And it corresponds to the density of the stony ground dots, just as the density of the green, right? And sort of the rule of thumb there is it is 1 radius between those dots down here on extremely stony ground, right? 1 diameter of the dot themselves
Hey, thanks for doing this. First of all, John. One comment I wanted to comment on was one thing that we often see, and which I personally think is okay, is you often see the rough open with marsh and green slash.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's one area where it is okay to have multiple of those. So I wanted to put that out there for the group, but also the other way to imply that a marsh, if you feel it's really important for visibility purposes to show that it's an impassable marsh with vegetation, you can always just use the darkest green with a crossable marsh, right?
Right.
That's all.
Any other comments on combinations you've seen that are really tough to read?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So we just realized the Vasquez Rocks map has some open land with scattered bushes with the green dots, but with the stripes over it. Because when we updated it for the championships to be the green dots, there were some areas that had the stripes over them with the white dots, and we didn't clear up all of that apparently. So at some point we'll go field check it and figure out what pattern makes the most sense there.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a good point that Claire brings up of these are not necessarily static. If you go back to a previous version, it was ISOM 2000 was the last major update to this. There were some other possibilities there, right? And they continue to evolve the standards in the document. Ross. Ross Burnett, I see your hands up.
You aren't muted. Maybe your microphone isn't working.
Yep.
I think we better.
Yep, we got a brief
maybe.
moment of sound there, Ross, but nothing else.
Oh, sorry. Am I on? I was.
Yes, there you go.
No, I was just wondering. Don't you think there's a case could be made that for uncrossable marshes, some of those combinations should be allowed to show different colors to help you differentiate which is which? That is, for navigation purposes. If you've got a whole bunch of uncrossable marshes in an area, the orienteer should be able to distinguish, am I at this one or that one?
Right. Yeah, that is the counter argument, right? And what they allow is really 3 versions, right? I guess wooded, right? White background, light yellow, rough open background, and then one of the scattered bushes or trees. And I guess they presume that a lot of it is really just, are you getting that big open grassy marsh, or is it a forested sort of thing, or is it some sort of combination and calling it good enough because you're going to have to go around it? But so do bear in mind that, as Ross brought up, the mapper maybe, if they're following ISOM strictly, may be forced into simplification they're not super happy with, right? And that is what it is. Moving on to quick quiz here. Let you stare at this for a second. Which one of these are pavement? Which one of these are gravel? How do you know?
You need to share your screen, John.
Thanks. Which one's pavement? Which one's gravel? How do you know? This one that would have tricked me, right? But by ISOM, there is no difference, right? The difference in a borderline or not is whether the boundary itself is distinct, not whether it is paved or graveled, something that is considered all weather. Now, let's be honest, sort of an indistinct boundary where it's hard to draw is much more common with gravel, right? Where, okay, it's sort of very gravelly here, it's very grassy over there, and there's a transition zone, right? But I have seen that with, crumbling asphalt that has a transition zone too, right? But it certainly pops out much more with a dark line, and sometimes a mapper will just choose to make it pop out with a borderline, because it is more obvious, particularly at speed, right? How about this little quiz? How about the roads? So again, it's actually either, right? The ISOM defines it as merely an all-weather road, and the difference is in width. Obviously, one is more prominent than the other, but it takes up more space on the map, right? So a mapper is having to make some choices there. on what they want to show. And I think you'll see that as a theme as we go through slides, is there's a lot of choices mappers have to make to paint the best picture for you to make your route choice and navigation decisions. Right? We are all familiar with the basic trails, right? Footpath symbol, which is thicker and longer dashes. The small footpath, the normal trail symbol, and then the less distinct or the indistinct trail symbol there that has additional spacing every two dashes, right? Less familiar is that the way they join tells you something about the junction, right? So over here on the bottom left, that is intended to be a distinct trail junction, right? Where there be no doubt that you are at that trail junction, right? Whereas the bottom middle, where they don't actually join, they get close, that is intended to be an indistinct junction, right? So that something that you very well may miss if you were traveling on the diagonal trail and just not seeing that there is an offshoot. And vice versa, if you were coming down this, much easier to just run off the edge of the trail and hit the next one, right? Now, so what's going on over here on the right-hand side? I would argue you have poor cartography going on, right? So in either software, OCAD or OOM, the two common mapping softwares, you have the ability to control where those dashes are and fix things like this. So either that was not done, or I will throw out that one of the classic losses of information if you move a map file back and forth between OCAD and OOM is that sort of drafting detail, because the software does that bit a little bit differently. And so, Kelly, you have a hand up.
Yeah, so I'm an inexperienced mapper, but I have some work under my belt, and I have a 7500 scale map where sometimes it seems hard to distinguish the difference between small footpath and less distinct small footpath. I don't know if it's because of the scale or maybe I screwed something up. Is that a problem some people have, or is it maybe just something I'm doing?
So the first thing I would check is when you click on those symbols in whichever software you're using, look at the shape of the vertex, the little points, whether they're squares, diamonds, circles. The software does it differently because when you change the type of vertex, that's when it adjusts where those dashes are. And I have seen some where the whole trail was drawn with dash vertexes, and then the software just goes nuts, right? It doesn't have any normal vertices to deal with. So that would be my quick answer to that particular mapping question. The other one would be if it's a real short indistinct trail, the two softwares do that a little bit differently, neither of them very well. Often mappers will choose to draw short segments with literally just using short segments of regular footpath. I think Christina is quickly going to throw in the penalty flag here. You tricked me into mapping.
Sorry.
I was ready, my finger on the mute button.
All right, so another quick question, right? Which of these, the stream, the seasonal stream, the ditch, the narrow marsh, and I'm using colloquial terms. A lot of the official terms in ISOM are clunky. Which of these have water? Which of these are dry? I would argue it completely depends. Depends on how wet things are at the moment, right? So what is it that differentiates these two? A stream from a ditch? Is it water? Is it absence of water? Again, I would argue it's depth, right? Both of them could be wet if you just had recent rains. Both of them could be dry if you did not, right? But in either case, you ought to be able to tell the difference from the depth. And There was a common practice decades ago that narrow marsh would be incorrectly called a wet ditch. I think I've literally seen that in legends, but that it is not the case.
Yeah, I'd argue width as well.
Width would also
one
be
of my
a good
latest mapping projects. I don't know, I guess the area's had a dry summer, so all the streams are bone dry. But the ones I'm mapping as seasonal streams are, you can step across them. And there are others that, like the stream bed that's totally dry, is like 2 or 3 meters wide.
Yeah.
So clearly that's a major stream.
Sure. Yeah. And there is a thicker version of the stream symbol to help with that as well. Right. And here's a map snippet where you literally have a reentrant, there's water coming down this reentrant next to the trail, right? And it has carved differing depths that were worth showing in this particular case. Right. Kind of an insane level of differentiation, right? But you can imagine that in some places there are lots of places to put a control, right? But in some places there, you could have the control pretty well out of sight from competitors, versus in other places, it's going to be visible from far away. All right, some more little nuances of the ISOM. Which of these letters represent bridges? And if you drove your old rental car at the orienteering event down this particular road, would you get wet tires anywhere? Right, and the answer is you've got bridges there at A, B, and C, right? And the cartographic principle there is the road's on top, right? Versus over here, the stream is on top. Right, so that should, in theory, get your rental car tires wet, unless it's an Arizona creek, I guess. Then it'll still be dry. So then the question is, you've got this sort of elaborate bridge symbol. What is special about A versus B, right? And ISOM defines that as a bridge/tunnel. Right. So to map something this way, it's really supposed to be passable underneath that bridge. So you could be running down the stream and go right underneath the road. It also cautions that if you're intending that as a course setter, you're really supposed to put a purple crossing point symbol across that. Right. Because that is a pretty unusual situation, at least in ISOM forest maps. A little more common in the symbology is better supports that on sprint maps. And then talking about regular bridges, getting away from road bridges here, regular trail, regular streams. The principle in ISOM is that if you have a centered trail dash centered on a stream crossing or a ditch, right, that there is a small bridge there. Right, that you would keep your feet dry. Might be a little culvert, might be a classic bog bridge or sort of a mountain biker footbridge, something that gets you over that stream, right? And then conversely, if it is not there, that you're getting wet feet or you're sort of hopping over a ditch. And again, you can control that as a mapper. So it can get very tedious if you have a trail and a stream that are going back and forth. Tedious to do right. And again, over here on the right-hand side, there's a couple examples of what I would say is poor cartography, right? Because it isn't centered. It's who's on top over here, right? Trail or stream. So you're leaving it up to the runner to guess. And this may be worth a pause for experienced mappers if you have done or tried anything else to help with that, particularly when it's not just a little footbridge out in the woods, but a bridge out in the woods. Any comments on that? Yeah, Will.
Hey, John. Thanks. these poor cartography issues with the dash lines and where they cross each other and whatnot, and which ones go over and under. I've never actually messed around with that. Can you adjust the dash spacing or whatever it is in OOM? And are you like adjusting where the dashes start, or like individual dashes are you adjusting?
Yeah, so the easiest way to think about it, and Christina's hand's getting close to the button again. The easiest way to think about it is, and I'm going to go back to sharing screen here, is in both software, you're going to put a dash vertex when you want the bridge. And one way to do it when you don't want the bridge is to cut the trail.
Oh, okay. So we can just use a vertex there. We'll kind of.
And actually, what you would do here, what I did here was I put a vertex on the stream itself to force the blue to be nice and centered.
And then how about which one's over or under? How do you adjust?
You're literally adjusting it by cutting it away or forcing it to be there.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So it is worth talking about some of the symbols that are the dearly departed. And, we are 8 years into this new symbology, right? So when you go, oh, it's okay, we've got this old map, we're doing a big event on it, it's still okay to use these. I would argue it's not, because we have junior elites who they were in elementary school when that old map standard was retired, right? And they don't deserve to have to know the current standard and the last one just to compete, right? So which of these have been retired? The answer is 3 of those 4 have been retired, right? They no longer exist as features. And this is a quick introduction to what I call the lucky charms. So the previous set of standards had a lot of symbols, same symbol, different colors. And one of their goals in this latest update was to allow vision impaired orienteers to not have to differentiate between anything except a solid black color and one shape, one color shade version of that particular shape, right? So they came up with some other shapes to use out there, including adding the little dot to the small tree or bush, right? To differentiate it from other similar size symbols that are out there. I'm not sure why they went with, they didn't necessarily keep that going with the 3 different versions of a pit symbol waterhole, but I'm not on the IOF committee, so I'm sure it's deep in their minutes if anyone cared enough. Other symbols that have been retired that I still see on maps on occasion, right? The black out of bounds, the black stripe out of bounds, right? The railway in sort of its latter version. And then the firing range and the grave symbol are also gone. Yeah, Ted.
What symbol do you use for a grave now then?
Yeah, I think they just expect it to be the olive drab out of bounds, because who orienteers in a cemetery?
We have individual graves, single graves.
Yikes.
So it's too small for olive green. I was just curious.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe the Carn memorial symbol would be my first guess, but it's a big one, right? It takes up a lot of space.
You can always use a black X or a black circle for it. Just a man-made feature.
Yeah, but I don't like that.
Yeah.
Confused with everything else. No, but go ahead.
Worth a slide here on form lines. So the quick quiz: which of those 2 form lines, A or B, contains useful information? Think about that for a second. Of course, it's B, right? A is really just a halfway contour. It's showing nothing different from the contour above or below it, right? And form lines are not intended to be intermediate contours, right? They are the mapper's tool to show shape and to emphasize shape. And I'll give you some examples here, right? So this is a base map, perfectly good 5-meter contours, trail running through there. It's uphill to the southwest and downhill to the east. In this particular example, I cropped it on purpose. But mappers are typically going out with helper contours, and what you see here in blue are the 1-meter helper contours, right? And you can see when you're looking at this that there's some more stuff going on that's falling between the main contour interval, right? So ISOM recommends that the first thing you do is, hey, can you capture some of that by just cheating the contour lines, right? And they allow you to cheat it, to deviate it up to about 25%. And these 3 areas that I used yellow to highlight, or 4 areas, are spots where you can see I adjusted the contour to capture the shape of the land a little bit better, right? To emphasize the spur and to capture this weird sort of double-pronged reentrant going on there. But you still see that, hey, wait a minute, even after I adjust the contours, I got stuff going on here that is not shown, right? You got a little spur here, you got a hilltop, and that's where a form line comes in. So if used sparingly, they can really help emphasize what's going on out there. And I highlighted here in green, it's not the vegetation, but just highlights of areas that I specifically was targeting with the form lines in this particular case, including putting a form line here to sort of emphasize where the flat ends, right? And where the edge of the hill begins. And when I get done with form lines as a mapper, I'm often looking for spots where, hey, back to this example A up top, where are my form lines just doing what the contours are doing, right? And there is a section here that if I expanded this out, I actually left that because there's a saddle going on here that needed some differentiation. Other mappers would maybe cut it and get rid of just this section of form line there, right? Because the less form line you show on a map, in general, the better, as long as you're capturing all the detail that's out there. And this is probably also worth a pause for experienced mappers to comment here.
John, maybe you have this in another slide, but I wonder if it's worth saying a little something about how those contours are created. Are you drawing those all by hand, or?
Yeah. I don't have another slide for it, but it is. I think you can pull it out of this slide, right? This was purely auto-generated, right? And you can see that it matched this blue is a OCAD LiDAR output, right? And it's not terrible, right? And once upon a time, we'd have been really happy with contours that were that detailed, right? But to get to the level of nuance that's going on over here on the right, you realistically are drawing a lot of that by hand. And Jeff and I have different, we've worked different projects that have gone different directions, right? So there are certainly projects where it's just going to be faster to draw it all by hand from the get-go. And there are other projects where it is faster to start with what came out as an auto-generated contour and make adjustments from that. And I do some crazy combination of both.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning for those on the call that are less experienced as mappers that what John is talking about here is probably the hardest thing to do well as a mapper. It takes a lot of experience to be able to look at that LiDAR data and look in the terrain for that matter and see, okay, where should I draw that contour line?
Christina's hands up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add and bring this back to for the runner. That is part of what makes when you get one of those maps where someone has just given you auto-generated all the contours, why it might feel a little different than running on a map that has been painstakingly drafted by an experienced mapper. So that's where this comes in. It's something to think about when you're running. You know, how old are these contours? Where did they come from? When you go into it, because if you know that someone has gone through and created what you see on the right box, that's a really different experience than just using something that was generated automatically. Because it's someone has used their artistic license and like sense of, as an orienteer, what am I going to see, as opposed to where, you know, at the 5 meter mark, at the 10 meter mark, this is what's happening. Okay.
Okay. Worth talking out of bounds for a little bit. There is olive drab out of bounds. It's my sort of colloquial talk on it, the area that should not be entered. It used to be called settlement in the older manual. And it calls for only contours and prominent features, railways, buildings, that sort of thing to be shown. It also calls
Bodies of water,
for,
usually, right?
what's that?
Bodies of water, too. Normally,
Bodies of
right?
water, right? And it calls for a black borderline where there is a distinct edge, right? So here you can see what is suburbia, right? These are generally very clear edges that follow property boundaries of, you know, this is someone's mowed backyard and then suddenly woods, right? And the other thing it calls for is if you have a path that goes through it that is intended for orienteers to be allowed to go down, you specifically add a white gap in there. Even if it was out in the open, it would be a white gap because I think that makes it jump out to the maximum extent. And you can see in this example that you can substitute other border lines, right, when fences are relevant, to put them in there. Well, there's other out of bounds, of course. There is the purple crosshatch out of bounds that is intended to show some detail through, right? And it has 3 flavors based on the edge marking, right? So here with a dashed edge marking, that is intended to be used for intermittent marking in the terrain. So not a constant line, not a fence or something like that. But classic example in my mind is no trespassing signs that are, you know, every other tree, sort of no trespassing signs you can't miss would be an example of that. And then if there's no border marking at all, then it's you can't tell out in the terrain. You have to really pay attention as a runner, as a navigator, to stay out of those areas. And I didn't show an example typically used only in events of, you know, something that's continuously marked with a tape boundary to keep people out. And in this particular case, the mapper is trying to show the difference between what is obviously, oh, hey, that's somebody's backyard, that's private property, and what is, oh, well, it's private property, but it looks just like the woods right next to it. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, quick question going back up to the map in the upper left. The trail in the lower left part of that does not have a white gap. Was that intended to show something that should not be done?
No, that would be my my mapper's license, and you've caught me in a violation of ISOM.
Okay, because it is much harder to notice immediately that other path crossed.
Yeah.
And then after you finished talking about that section,
yeah,
there's a path there too, but it's got yellow and green instead of the white.
Yeah.
It's definitely harder to notice.
So yeah, and that is a good example where I was trying to do something tricky as a mapper. Hey, this is really grassy here and whatever, but it is in violation of ISOM, and as Mike just pointed out, it's doesn't jump out at you nearly as well as over here. And let's be honest, there's no significant navigation going on there. It would be used by a course setter to get in or out of the woods, right? So sometimes as a mapper, it's not good to be clever. A couple of hands up here. Chuck. Chuck, we're not hearing you. If you're,
I'm trying to unmute.
there we go. You have unmuted.
On the same image on the top by where the white denoted trail is, above the trail, there's no black line along the olive green.
Yeah, so that means that it is not distinct on exactly where the edge is what ISOM says. Reality is when I mapped that, I put a black line in there and I wasn't happy with it because it just obscured things. So I got rid of it. Ted.
I believe ISOM actually says any trail or road that's in the olive green, you're allowed to run on. The white does make it much more obvious. So you shouldn't be put trail to run on if you don't want people to be on it. So that one you have in the top left corner is legal. It's hard to read.
Yeah.
But that lower part where you go to the loop in the road.
Yeah.
That says, that's mapped area. You could run that little trail through that gap to the road.
Yep. And I think real tricky stuff like that, a course consultant and event advisor would, make sure that a course is not, that's not the challenge of a course, right?
You wouldn't want to use that, but it is legal.
Simplify it for a runner and give them a real challenge, right? There are a couple other out of bounds flavors. So there is a boundary line symbol, right? A real thick purple that is intended, it shall not be crossed, right? Versus lots of things in ISOM are impassable, but unlike sprint standards where the impassable features are by rule, shall not be crossed. That is not the case in ISOM forest maps, right? So an uncrossable cliff, if you see a way up or down it, have at it, right? If an uncrossable fence in ISOM, you can cross. If you see a way over it, around it, through it, you're allowed to do that unless it also has a reinforcing purple on. So I gave this example as a example of where the course setter is saying you may not cross that particular uncrossable fence. There are some things in OUSA rules that prevent you, I think, from crossing uncrossable water. But it's not a map thing. Okay. Worth briefly taking a foray here into 2024. IOF came up with a updated control description or clue specification, and they do a very good job of mapping. If you're going to use the boulder clue, it has to correspond. The center of the circle has to be either this is boulder and large boulder by number, right, in the ISOM manual, right? So sometimes you'll see those. Something I always check as a course consultant that the center of the circle matches what is in the clue. And there is inside there, they give a pictorial example of each and every symbol. And rootstock is an interesting one, and I have a slide on that, and it's by itself here because there are 5 mapper defined symbols, right? Sort of a miscellaneous or a prominent landform, prominent water, prominent vegetation feature, which often we just call a rootstock, but can have other definitions, right? And in general, they are supposed to be clued with an X, right, or an O. But rootstock or stump has its own strangely enough, has its own clue symbol. But by ISOM, you are supposed to give the definition of that symbol on the map itself, and ideally in course notes ahead of time. Although there is always I always remember as a mapper that there's always a language barrier. Somebody at your event, English isn't their first language. And number two is I've run plenty of events where I never had time to read the mapper's notes or look on the margin for the map. So I hope it's clear, right? And we are nearing the end here. Very wordy slide, which I apologize for. This one is worth hours and hours of mappers talking. So I'm going to give you a real quick overview for runner's sake. To get right the minimum sizes and minimum gaps and generalizing things and making things legible, that is hard to do. In principle, the darker the object, black objects, 100% green or blue or white, those have the smallest possible footprint because you can pick those out easiest. And the lighter the color, so a mix like a yellow or any of the screens, right? Medium green or light light yellow or any of those patterns, rough open with scattered trees or the green stripe patterns, those are harder to see. So the minimum size is bigger that a mapper has to use. There is also a minimum width to things, right? So sometimes as a mapper, you are scratching your head on, I've got this thicket. To match the rest of the map, it would be this color, but it needs to be this wide, and the passage between the thickets has to have a certain width based on its color. What on earth am I going to do here, right? So for you as a competitor, what you should probably remember is some of those over mappings you see on a map are on purpose, right? Because a mapper can show a small clearing more distinctly in dark yellow than they can in light yellow. Even though all else being equal, the vegetation sort of matches light yellow everywhere else on the map. But the mapper chose to show it as dark yellow because it pops out at you. He or she can use a smaller symbol. And that is done fairly routinely by mappers, violating consistency to give you a better, more detailed product. If you want to geek out on map symbols, there is a great new wiki, relatively new on iOS website. And let me see here if I can jump to that. No, I got to jump out of slide mode here. I'm going to jump to the wiki and go live here. You've got 4 different versions. We'll go into the forest one, right? And they go by symbol. Right, so let's go to null, right, and it gives you exactly what the ISOM manual says, right, including its sizes in a sort of architectural drawing, and then it gives you these photos of good examples of nulls, right, and sometimes they talk about in here they give a little context, right, on that particular null. And in some of these, they give you bad examples of nulls, right? So, yeah, anthill doesn't cut it. An old tree pillow, right? Or probably a rootstock that decayed away, just not big enough on all sides, right? So you can go down a rabbit's hole on the IOF wiki and have a grand old time. Go back into slideshow here. So you know that that's out there. And that brings me to the end of the sort of formal portion of this. And I'm happy to come off of SlideShare here and facilitate a discussion because I don't have all the right answers. And I hope you picked something up that you can use as a competitor, as a runner. Um,
Thank you.
Ted, a question or a comment?
I'll make one other comment that I think is true, but a lot of times competitors get confused on when they see contours at the bottom of the hill and the top of the hill, they often assume it's the very bottom and the very top, and that is not always the case. So they need to adjust for that in their thinking if you're not used to that. Don't know.
Yeah, I would. I'll make a comment on that, Ted, which is that is true. The goal of a good mapper is to make the map intuitive, right? So when John was showing that slide about his different is drawing the contours by hand and shifting the contours up and down, right? That's the kind of thing that would come into play is, okay, how do orienteers expect the contours? What do they expect the contours to mean? And you might try to adapt for that, but of course not every map is done with the same kind of style or thought process in mind.
No, I agree, but I'm saying, but it's in many cases, the bottom of the hill is not always the very, very bottom. There may be a little more. And when people are hanging stuff at the bottom of the hill, people get confused because I've seen orienteers get confused because of how they read the contours. They just assume it's always the bottom, even when it may not be, because there may be sense why you can't map everything along the bottom.
Yeah.
Yeah. The example you showed of using the out of bounds borderline to reinforce essentially the idea that a fence is truly you should not cross, not merely it's probably a bad idea. I'm not sure I've ever seen that in real life. To use that without one side of the fence or the other being actually marked as out of bounds with cross-hatching. Would you expect that to actually be like flagged in the course notes?
Yeah, I think it would, John, and I agree with you. It is a very contrived to have a boundary like that doesn't also have an out of bounds on one side or the other would be super unusual.
I think you use it sometimes in the UK, where they have where they've got a lot of stone walls and stuff around fields.
I mean, I could see it being used just as the equivalent of like the artificial barriers in Sprint. It's a way of precluding certain route choices that you don't want to be available to the competitors even.
And this is the
But
one you're talking about.
I haven't
here.
personally encountered it. You just saw the comment or question in the chat, John?
Yeah. So the question about I'll read it out here for those that don't have the chat open. When should you expect to see a downhill tick mark? They seem to be more frequent on European maps and study materials I've seen than U.S. maps. Any comments from experienced mappers on that?
I mean, my take has always been that if it's an actual closed depression, then tick marks are obligatory. And everything else is a question of, should I put a tick mark here to prevent people from being unable to tell up from down at a glance? So those are basically artistic license. And there's no absolute test you can apply to say, yes, it's needed here. No, it isn't. If you've got a map where that's carved by water erosion, then usually there are water features running along the bottoms of things, and you don't need very many tick marks.
Yeah, I have found the longer I map, the more tick marks I put on, because I think some of it comes with experience and running into cases where somebody has been confused by it, and then there's no reason not to, although they can get excessive. My general rule at this point is anytime there's a change of direction, so classically a saddle, I will, if the saddle is not tight where you can see it right away, I will try to put in tick lines, right? Because those are typically where people invert contours, and that leads to navigational disaster, right?
No one has a hand raised as far as I can tell, and we are at 9:30 Eastern, so we can call it a night without any shame. So last chance to put your hand up. No. Okay, so thank you. It's been a very good turnout, so glad that a lot of people were interested in this topic. Thank you, Jon, for presenting your wisdom gathered over many years.
Yeah.
And
now
yeah, have a good night, everyone.
I'll stay on here. John Daniels, you had a hand up.
Yeah, just a quick question. I saw your helper contour interval in your example is 1 meter. Is that good enough? I've seen tighter than that, down to 10 centimeters. Is there any reason to go that tight?
Yes. On a project I care about, I will run both. I often don't go to 10 centimeters. I'll often stay at 25. And one of them is useful in places where it's steep, and one of them is useful in places where it is crazy flat.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, personally, I've never gone below 25 centimeters. Even when I was doing, extremely flat floodplain.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of latitude to decide where to put form lines.
Yeah.
To catch what little significant contour detail there was.
Okay, thanks, fellas.
And Tim McLaren, you had a hand up briefly. Oh, okay.
Yep.
Well, good night, everyone.
Yes.
Good night. Night. We need to be totally unrecognizable.